Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon or morning, wherever you are located. I'm Erin Scanlon, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about how we can address ableism in physics higher education. I am joined here with Jackie. You want to say hey?
Hi, I'm Chini, coming to you from University of Central Florida.
One thing before we get into our talk is if you notice in the right-hand side of our slide, we have a QR code as well as a link to the slides. I will also show this on our last slide. So if you'd like to copy that down, it is available for you there. So to start, I figured I would begin with the end. I would start with our punchline of what we're planning to talk about today. So we know that who we plan for within our courses shows that who we expect as well as who we want to participate within our communities. So if we're designing our courses only for a certain set of people or a certain set of abilities or needs, then we're only going to get those types of people within our professional communities. There is this wonderful book called Academic Ableism written by Jay Dolmaj, and he has a quote that says, academia powerfully mandates able-bodiedness and able-mindedness, as well as other forms of social and communicative hyperability. In fact, few institutions do a better or more comprehensive job of promoting ableism. So when we're talking about the higher education setting, we know that we have ableism endemic in that place that we need to contend with. As a very brief definition, ableism is the discrimination in favor of able-bodiedness, but don't worry, we're going to come back to ableism again later in our talk. So we know that if we have ableism present within our workplace, we have to overcome and be intentional in order to address that ableism. Specifically, our claim is that we as instructors need to design our courses as well as our research spaces to support the variety of students' needs, abilities, and interests. So throughout the workshop today, Jackie and I are going to give you a brief overview of some of the background information related to disability, including laws and representation of disability in higher education. Then we're going to move on to talking about ableism and some examples of what that looks like. And then finally, we're going to introduce our variation for planning tool as a way to identify ableism in practice and then universal design to eradicate those barriers. So that's the big overview for today. So let's dive in a little bit to talking about disability. Within the disability justice spaces, there are two different prevalent models of disability. If you look at the picture on the left-hand side of the screen, it shows a person that's wearing a t-shirt that says the problem, and there are a bunch of arrows pointing in towards the person that are also labeled the problem. In the individual model of disability, disability lies within the person, and it is something that needs to be changed or remediated. In the individual model, which is also known as the medical model of disability, we typically ask people with disability to take on the burden of changing or doing any sort of remediation in order to engage with the learning environment. So again, individual model disability is a part of the person. On the other hand, we have the social model of disability, and that's the picture on the right-hand side of our screen. In this case, the person's no longer, their shirt no longer says the problem, and now the arrows are labeled as barriers pointing away from the person. In the social model of disability, disability is really about the interaction between a person's impairment and the environment in which they are becoming disabled. So it is really about the interaction between the person and the environment. So in the social model of disability, the burden for change is removed from the individual and instead is placed on the learning environment as well as the culture in which the learning is happening. So we take up the social model of disability in the work that we do because it allows for us as instructors to play a role in making the spaces more accessible, more inclusive, and in reducing ableism in our workspaces. So we're going to move forward with the social model of disability. Along with the different models of disability, there are different ways of talking about disability. And in fact, disability language is pretty contested. Different people prefer different types of language to describe themselves and their disability. For example, some people prefer person with a disability, some people prefer disabled people, some people prefer other kinds of language. So I can't give you a suggestion of which one to use, except to ask the individual what they prefer. So when you're having conversations with individuals, we can ask them what terminology or language they prefer, and then utilize that in our practice with them. So let's look a little bit about the representation of disabled people within higher education. So if we start with the World Health Organization says that 15% of the world's population has a disability. If we look in the higher education environment, disabled people comprise approximately 10 to 20% of the student population. And that range of values comes from the fact that they had different definitions of disability categories from year to year. The more recent data is leaning more towards that 20% range within higher education. They Disabled people also enroll in science and engineering majors at similar rates to students without disability. So that's about 28% of the different student populations. If we look towards the workforce, disabled people represent about 9% of employed physical scientists, about 3% of life, physical, and social scientists, as well as comprise about 10% of the federal, civilian, non-postal employees. So we know that people with disabilities are present within our classrooms, they're present within our workspaces, and they're present within our research spaces. So we need to design our spaces to support the wide range of people depending on their needs, abilities, and interests. One other reason we need to do that is because of the legal frameworks related to supporting people with disabilities. In the K-12 space, we have the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disability Education Act, that mandates that K-12 institutions not only identify students who have disabilities and support them in getting diagnosis, but then also providing instructional support for students inside and outside the classroom. When students transition from K-12 to the post-secondary environment, there's a significant change in the type of support and the type of requirements for institutions. At the post-secondary setting, institutions are no longer required to identify and diagnose students. So that burden of identifying what kinds of disability people have, as well as collecting documentation, lies within the individual. However, we do have the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, as well as a couple of sections of the Rehabilitation Act that govern higher education. Specifically, they say that equitable access to education should be mandated for disabled students, as well as that discrimination based on disability status is prohibited. So we know that we can model disability using the social model. People with disabilities are present in higher education in our workforce, and there are legal requirements about supporting people with disabilities. However, if we look at the current state of access and inclusion in higher education, we see that post-secondary faculty often lack awareness about and training to support disabled students within their teaching and research spaces. Additionally, Jackie and I and some of our colleagues looked at the STEM curricular materials, and we found that they are typically not designed for disabled students or designed with disabled students in mind. As well as if we look at more the cultural side of this issue, we see that STEM professionals hold more negative attitudes about disabled people than their colleagues in other academic disciplines. So we see that there are still some barriers and issues that we need to address within our workplaces. So why is that, you think? What could be the reason for why we see these different access barriers? Jackie and I claim that it has to do with ableism. So what I would like you all to do for a second, we're going to take about a minute, and I'm going to have you all think on your own and jot down your current ideas about ableism. So what is it? What does it look like? Where or when does it occur? So again, we're gonna pause for a minute. I'm gonna allow you to reflect on your own, and then I will turn it over to Jackie. So go ahead and reflect. All right. I think that's been about a minute. So let's look to what the literature says about ableism.
Thanks, Erin. Like Erin said, on this slide, we're going to look at some definitions and explanations about how we can think about ableism. And the first bullet here describes that ableism is discrimination or prejudice in favor of able-bodied people. And one thing that I think is important to realize at this that ableism doesn't require us to be actively discriminating against disabled folks. The problem with ableism is often that we're not thinking about disabled folks that well at all. So we are centering able-bodied people and creating situations and environments that privilege able-bodied people because that's who we are centering. And ableist beliefs include ideas such that able-bodied people are inherently superior to disabled people, that able-bodied people possess essential qualities to participate in normal society, and that able-bodied people should be designed for physically, cultural, and systemically. So the idea here is that because we are centering able-bodied people, we're doing that for a reason. We are taught by growing up in an ableist society that ableist folks are the ones that matter the most because those are the ones who are able to participate, as it says in quote, normal society. And that idea is reinforcing. If we are centering able-bodied people, then we are designing for able-bodied people, and then able-bodied people are the ones who are able to participate. Oops, a quote from our colleagues, Adrian Traxler and Jennifer Blue says, everything we do is embedded in society. Everything is political. Physics is steeped in this tradition as well. So we've probably all heard the idea that physicists think of physics as a culture of no culture, but that's not possible because just like everything else, physics exists within a society, and the ideas in that society permeate into the physics community. And what this means for us is that by default, we are all ableist unless we are in a moment of being actively anti-ableist. Some everyday examples of ableism. On the left of the screen is a tweet that went viral back in 2016 or so when Whole Foods started selling peeled oranges in a little container. And the tweet reads, if only nature could find a way to cover these oranges so we didn't need to waste so much plastic on them. And the idea here being that the tweeter was not considering a person who may not be able to, due to the dexterity in their hands, peel the orange themselves, and that providing the orange in the plastic container creates access for a person who may not otherwise have access. And this is a common point of tension between like environmental concerns and disability concerns, both around physical mobility, so things like this orange, as well as plastic straws, as well as around mental health conditions as well, whether folks have the are able in a moment to make the most environmentally sound decision. So this is a common tension that I think is likely to be common in physics as well, because a lot of us think about environmental concerns. Another example, this is a photo that Erin took, I think, when you were traveling for some of our projects. And what we see here on the right hand of the screen is a bathroom that has, it looks like it is meant to be an accessible bathroom because it has a grab bar next to the toilet. The toilet looks mighty low. But the most important barrier here is that they've stuck a bunch of extra chairs in the bathroom so that there's no longer the extra movement space that was originally in the bathroom to help make it accessible. So these are just some everyday examples of ableism that we encounter all the time. So what does ableism look like in a STEM community? So a common example is not making use of microphones, either at an academic conference or even locally in your classroom. in a meeting with more than just a couple of folks, people will say, "I'm a teacher. I don't need a microphone." And that again is assuming that everyone in the audience has the same hearing capacity that you have, whereas some folks even use hearing aids that are tapped into the microphone system in a room. Another example is believing that students who have ADHD, learning disabilities, dyslexia, or any other related impairment are lazy or not trying hard enough. And another example can be the shapes of desks in classrooms that only allow certain body shapes, sizes, and mobilities, dexterities to access them. Um, have we considered differences in how people's bodies are shaped and how they function in creating a space for them to access our classroom? Another example that we learned about in part of our research is a physics experiment that had multiple different levels to it, but not all of those levels were accessible by an elevator. So, what can we do about the ableism that is going to be at play in our environments based on just having grown up in an ableist society? So, first of all, we need to think about how students may vary. So, a common thing that we have heard from instructors, from researchers, is that we don't know who's going to be in a space, and so we can't plan for them. And what Erin and I try to argue is that what we could think about is what are the ways that students and people vary, and how can we plan for all of those variations in our instruction and research spaces. So we can use information about how people vary and how that may interact with the environments we've created to identify who we are privileging and who we are simultaneously taxing with our design. Then we can use universal design for learning to lower and or remove these barriers in our teaching and research environments. Overall, our goal is to proactively support all students regardless of their disability status. And in the next set of slides, we're going to go through a number of tools and examples that we have developed to show how we envision this process occurring. So learner variation, we created a toy model to help us think about the different ways that people may vary. And we believe that all people vary in their needs, abilities, and interests, and that these needs, abilities, and interests exist across a multidimensional spectrum. So if we think broadly about what are the kinds of things people are able to do based on literature review, Erin and I proposed this toy model for 6 dimensions of ability that include physical mobility, such as strength, mobility, dexterity, and endurance, health, which is our ability to regulate body systems, cognitive, which is tasks like planning, remembering, interpreting, and understanding, visual, including aspects such as acuity and color, hearing, including aspects like loudness and pitch, and then emotional mental health, including things like feelings, emotion, attitudes, and beliefs. So we envision these 6 dimensions as different types of abilities that individuals have. And an individual's ability then can vary in many different ways. So, across these dimensions, there may be some conditions that impact multiple dimensions, but just because a person has a hearing impairment doesn't mean they also have a visual impairment. So, we could have differences in ability across these dimensions. Multiple people are going to vary along the same dimension, right? So within a class, within a research group, we're going to have people with different physical mobility abilities, for example. An individual's ability can vary day to day based on any number of things, but my physical mobility ability today may not be the same as it is tomorrow, and also across contexts. So my emotional mental health abilities may be different in one context compared to another.
All right, so let's have a couple of examples of what this looks like. We know that using this learner variation toy model, we can address the question of like, how do these variety of students' needs, abilities, and interests affect our teaching. And we can utilize this tool to help us reach our goal of designing courses that support learner variation. So as an example, I have selected two different instructional strategies that we can consider how the instructional strategies will load on or affect students in the course. So for example, for my two examples, I'm doing traditional lecture and individual clicker questions, and then we can consider how these different instructional practices load on the 6 different dimensions of ability. For example, both traditional lecture and individual clicker questions we would consider to be a medium load on the physical and mobility dimension. In a traditional lecture setting, instructors are typically expecting their students to be taking notes of some kind. So we're expecting them to engage in some note-taking method, which would involve either writing something or typing it out or some other means of doing that. So it's a medium. And similar for individual clicker questions, the students need to utilize the device, whether that be like a clicker or their phone, in order to answer the question. Health dimension would also load medium for the traditional lecture and individual clicker questions. Typically, when we think of a traditional lecture and individual clicker questions, we think that students are going to be in person, and there's always some inherent risk in having in-person events because people are going to be closer together, and so that can allow for spreading of illnesses, for example. If we look at the cognitive dimension, both traditional lecture and individual clicker questions would load high on that dimension because we're asking students to do a lot with their brains, right? We're asking them to pay attention, to connect the new information to other information that they already have, to answer questions, to think through a thought process, right? So both of these instructional strategies would be high on the cognitive dimension. Similarly, they're both high on the visual dimension. In a typical traditional lecture, the instructor will have something on the board, whether that be something that they're writing on the chalkboard, or it might be a lecture slide that they're sharing, or you might just ask the students to watch the instructor as they are doing a demonstration. And then for individual clicker questions, we also usually have to show them the question in some way. So we're asking them to utilize their visual ability to engage with the question. If we move on to hearing, traditional lecture loads high on that dimension as students are typically expected to be listening to the instructor or whatever instructional materials are being presented at that time. However, individual clicker questions would load low on the hearing dimension because usually the students are going to be working on their own and reflecting silently as they are answering the question, and thus they're not required to utilize their hearing ability while answering the question. Finally, if we move over to emotional mental health, again, traditional lecture is going to load high on the mental health dimension, as there's a lot of labor that goes into play while students are maintaining attention and focus over the course of the lecture. So that would load high on the mental health dimension. And then finally, individual clicker questions would load relatively low. Personally, how that would load on me depends on how much of my grade is affected by it. So the exact location of all of these different high, medium, and lows will vary depending on the specifics of your course. So that's one of the nice things about this tool, is that we can tweak it for the individual course. So now that we have considered how these different instructional practices load onto the different dimensions, we can create a representation to help us visualize these different loads.
Thanks, Erin. So we are just going to take that same information that was on the table Erin was presenting and look at it in a different format. So what we have here on the right-hand side of the screen is a radar chart that has the 6 dimensions of ability from our prior toy model around the circumference, and then has concentric circles that are representing the load that Erin had just presented in the table form. So we have low load at the center, shaded white, medium load in the middle, shaded in a light gray, and high load on the outer edge, shaded in a darker gray. And so we have translated over for both traditional lecture and individual clicker questions the load that we had assigned to those on the prior chart. So this is one example of multiple representation. Some people may find it easy to process information out of the table. For others of us, this visual representation may help us do that processing more. So for example, one thing that we see is that focusing on the visual dimension here, all of the instructional practices loaded high on this dimension, both traditional lecture and the red solid line, and individual clicker questions in the long dotted orange line. And what that indicates is this course will privilege students with strengths along the visual dimension and simultaneously tax students with limitations along the visual dimension.
So we can utilize this learner variation tool in order to identify, again, who we're privileging and who we're simultaneously taxing within our courses. Once we have identified those places where we want to incorporate more inclusive or accessible practices, we can then turn to what's called the Universal Design for Learning framework. And just as a brief overview, the Universal Design for Learning framework is a tool that instructors can utilize in order to proactively design their courses for a wide range of individuals. So what the next couple of slides we're going to go over is an example of how these different inclusive teaching practices align with the Universal Design for Learning framework and how these practices can help students access the information within the course. For example, one inclusive practice for traditional lecture would be to provide the lecture slides in advance of class. If you do so, that will allow students to, for example, they could take notes on the lecture slides. They can augment the slides. They can make the slide text bigger or smaller. They can add in their own notes. They can help know what is going to be happening within the course. So all of these different things that students can do just by providing them the slides in advance. If we look at the Universal Design for Learning framework, you'll notice that I have a number and some text associated with each of them. The number corresponds to the different checkpoints in the UDL framework, and then the words are the accompanying title. So providing lecture slides in advance would allow students to customize the display of information, as well as can help guide information processing and visualization. Another inclusive strategy instructors can use in traditional lecture would be to use a microphone during lecture. In my class, I teach relatively small classes at a regional campus. There are a maximum of 20 students. And in that space, I still find it to be useful to utilize a lecture microphone so that everybody can hear and understand me. This aligns with the checkpoint 1.2, which is offering alternatives for auditory information. The last example I'll give for traditional lecture is to provide ample breaks during long lectures. This can help students to facilitate their coping skills and strategies, right? How can helping students to learn how to maintain attention over a long course, as well as providing them some of those breaks to allow their brain to process. If we look over to individual clicker questions, we can identify additional inclusive teaching strategies. One of them would be to ensure that the applications that you're utilizing are compatible with assistive technologies. For example, a very popular clicker system is the iClicker system. So you want to ensure that the iClicker system is compatible with assistive technologies like screen readers or alternative keyboards. This, I think, is a really excellent place where you can partner with your Office of Disability Services within your university, right? The Office of Disability Service people know more about compatibility and assistive technology, as well as then you know about the content and how you'll be utilizing it in your course. So you can partner to find this best strategy. This also aligns with allowing alternatives for auditory information and alternatives for visual information. Another inclusive strategy we could use is to provide the questions in advance. This would allow, again, students to customize the display of information, as well as it can enhance their capacity for monitoring progress because they can know the kinds of questions you're going to be asking them about and ensure that they feel like they have mastered that content before class. Another inclusive strategy would be to provide ample time to answer questions. And exactly what is ample is another question for another time, but this can also support students in planning and strategy development. So we can take these inclusive teaching strategies and implement them into our classroom in order to address any barriers to access and participation that we identify. In addition to looking at the instructional environment, we also wanted to provide a few examples of what this could look like in the research environment. So I'm going to turn it over to Jackie to talk about this example.
Thanks, Erin. So yeah, just like we did with teaching, we have taken two research practices and thought about how those might load on the different dimensions of ability. So in the first case, in the first line, I'm looking at research experience for undergrads. So REUs, a typical one where we would have a student traveling from their home location to a different location to do research for the summer. We consider this to load high on the physical mobility dimension because it requires students to be able to physically travel to the research site, both the initial travel to get there, as well as the travel from wherever they are staying to the research site each day, and that may look different for different students. We also consider this to load high on a health dimension because it assumes that students are not going to need access to medical equipment that would be difficult for them to transport. And for a similar reason, we consider requiring students to travel for research experiences can also load high on the mental health dimension because it assumes that students can safely leave their typical community supports or recreate those supports at a different setting. We left cognitive, visual, and hearing as a medium load here. We did not anticipate specific differences between the distant research experience and a local research experience along those dimensions. But this is a tool for reflecting, right? So if you have other ideas, we'd be glad to hear about them in the Q&A later. The second practice that we've pulled out here for the research setting is editing a research paper using LaTeX, and this was inspired by a high energy physics community paper out of the Snow Mass Initiative, specifically on accessibility. We consider this to load medium on the physical mobility dimension because LaTeX does not natively interact with screen readers. And so the person may need to use something else in order to navigate within the LaTeX system based on what they are compared to what they are typically used to using. Another interesting dimension here is the visual dimension. And this was the main challenge that was brought up in the Snow Mass paper, which is that LaTeX fails to convert text to auditory specifically for equations, that there are big challenges with how LaTeX is able to switch modalities for explaining equations. Additionally, figures that are created in any paper may not be color vision deficiency friendly. I also would like to point out the impact on the mental health dimension for the co-editing process that may occur between a PI and a research student, and that getting feedback from a PI can have an impact on students' mental health, and that may be differential based on mental health conditions the student may have, like depression and anxiety.
Oops, I went too far. Sorry. There we
No,
go.
you're great. So again, we're going to break these practices down and think about what are some inclusive practices that we could use. And we went off template for our REU inclusive practices because we wanted to center a different type of skill that we think is important for the physics community to think about. And this is the idea of just normalizing access needs and bringing ideas about disability justice into our community spaces. So on the right-hand side of the screen, I have a quote from Sins Invalid, which is a disability justice centered group that has some really great resources. And there's an advocacy kit linked there. And this quote says, "Disability justice is collective liberation. All bodies and minds are unique, essential, and have needs that should be met." And so two ideas that we've pulled out of Sins Invalid's disability justice piece are the idea of access needs and interdependence. So access needs are anything that we need to require any resources we require to fully participate in a space or activity. And one thing that's really important about the concept of access needs is that we all have them. Some of us who are more able-bodied and able-minded have our access needs met by a default environment, but that doesn't mean that we don't have access needs in the first place. So many of you are likely accessing this presentation via your speakers, but the speakers are providing you access to the information. Some folks are using the closed captioning, and we sometimes act like that is the only step that is an access need, where actually all of these steps are meeting our access needs. So the idea here is to normalize discussion of our access needs within our research group and creating a culture where we talk about them. So we can do this by conducting regular access check-ins, where all of the researchers in the group share what access needs are being met and which of their needs should be revisited at that time. So this could include things like deciding in a meeting that the research group is going to take notes together on a cloud-based document so that we can go back and review what happened during a meeting later. And maybe that was not a practice at all, and we add that as a practice at 1 month, but then we also wanna, a month later, see how that's working. Is there anything that we need to do to make that even better meet the access needs of the individuals in our groups? Another important point is that we should anticipate and budget for the costs associated with providing access. So we're often surprised when someone comes into a space and has an access need that requires finances in order to support it. And like we started off at the beginning, that just shows who we were expecting to participate in an environment. And as a community, we need to get better about anticipating providing access from the get-go. The second idea that I have on this slide is normalizing access through interdependence. And this is in stark contrast with the idea of like the lone brilliant physicist, right? So it is not actually essential for all research team members to create to complete the same task. And so when we talk with research group leaders about what kinds of disabilities students may have and work in their research group, we often have folks start with whatever feels like the most difficult to accommodate in their setting. And one thing that can help in that case is to say, we don't even need to start from how are we going to help that person do this one task that you named, but how could we break that task up across group members so that all group members are having an authentic, engaging research experience? And like we said, this idea of shared notes is also an idea of interdependence. Some of us may have better focus during a meeting, and we can share that with other group members by keeping notes.
And then if we look at some of the paper editing inclusive practices, we can do things like utilize MathJax to accessibly render mathematical expressions. MathJax is just one example of a tool that we can utilize in order to render these mathematical expressions. But making sure that we are doing it accessibly is important to allow students to have an alternative to the visual information, as well as to support them in decoding and understanding the text, mathematical expressions, and any symbols or notation that we're utilizing. There are other types of accessibility tools that we can utilize, but MathJax is a great suggestion. Another kind of thing we can utilize is color blindness visualizers or color vision deficiency friendly style guides. I have a couple of links on the slide to examples of what these visualizers can look like. But essentially, if you upload an image of what a slide or a figure will look like, they will show you what it looks like to a person who has different types of color blindness. And again, utilizing these color vision deficiency friendly guides can allow students to have different ways of accessing the visual information. And then finally, if we look at supporting students along the emotional mental health dimension, we can look at and support students when they have these emotional reactions to reviews or feedback that they get on papers that they're working on. And it's important to help students to build up and utilize these personal coping skills and strategies because science isn't only about the science that we do, right? Like science gets done by people, and we want to make sure that the people are going to be supported to engage within the environment. So those were just a couple of examples of how we can apply this idea of learner variation both to the instructional as well as our research settings. We would like to close our talk today with a couple of different recommendations for instruction as well as recommendations for research. So overall, the process that we're suggesting that folks consider utilizing is that we first of all can identify barriers within our courses by critically examining our courses along accessibility and inclusivity lines. Once we have identified the barriers, we can identify inclusive instructional strategies that can help us to lower these barriers. And we can utilize frameworks like Universal Design for Learning to help us do that. Then we can implement the identified strategies, making incremental changes from semester to semester. And then finally, we can assess the impact of the strategies on our students or our research spaces. One thing I'd like to point out is there is this wonderful book and phrase from the disability justice space that says, "Nothing about us without us." This means that if we're doing research for or research about people with disabilities, we should include disabled people in that research process. So be careful when you are doing your assessment and consider including a wide variety of people who have a wide variety of identities in the work that you do. Just make sure you're considering the ethical implications of these kinds of things. So that's what we recommend the process that instructors engage with. We also have a few recommendations for research. Jack, you want to take it away?
Yeah, so our recommendations for research pieces include investigating and centering the unique experiences of disabled students in physics programs. Disabled students are the most knowledgeable about their own experience and their own needs, so it's important to create opportunities for them to share about their access needs, like we mentioned a few slides back. Um, we should then also take up suggestions of solutions to access needs and investigate their impact on diverse populations of physics learners and physics doers. We should realize that there's not going to be a one size fits all solution. And we can take a suggestion that someone made and apply it with a new person, but we want to see how that solution is working for each student that we make it available to. We should investigate the systemic changes necessary to make available time and resources for development. So physics teachers, physics researchers are very busy. We need to figure out systemically, how do we create the time in our professional community for individuals to be going through this professional development. We should remain attentive to community identities, especially regarding language. Erin mentioned at the beginning, we should ask individuals what language they use. We can also learn about what language is most common within certain communities and use that language as possible. So for example, learning about the difference between capital D deaf and lower D deaf, learning why autistic individuals may prefer autistic person rather than person with autism. Another thing that is important at the physics community level is to make sure that we are collecting disability status information in a way that is appropriate, that doesn't put a burden on disabled folks to identify and does not put them at risk, but that allows us to learn about how disability is represented in the physics community and to track changes over time and across programs. Some future research directions that we see for things like physics education research, maybe scholarship of teaching and learning research programs, are to attend to the intersectionality of individual identities and the varying impact of disability across other dimensions of identity. So the disability labels that a person has when they get to college are going to be impacted in different ways by different things. So certain labels are given out for example, to boys who are of color, more so than to white women, for example. Our social status may change our access to getting a disability identity label that then is going to impact our access to accommodations in a setting. So there's really a lot of complicated interplay between other identities and disability. We want to continue to move away from the medical model of disability, so putting the burden on the person to cope with our system, and rather move to changing our system to embrace a wider variety of human variation. And then also, it's important that we continue to zoom out from classroom accommodations to consider how disabled individuals are able to participate in the broader physics community overall. How can they have meaningful research experiences, meaningful conference participation, and so on. So we would like to close with a call to action that kind of counters how we started with only centering able-bodied folks. And we think that it is time, after a long history of positioning disabled individuals as a burden in the physics community, for physics education research to center the knowledge, skills, and experiences of disabled individuals, and to identify systemic change that will support full participation of disabled individuals in physics classrooms, laboratories, research experiences, and the broader community. And with that, we thank you for your attention. And there is some time, depending on your transition time, for questions in the Q&A. We have put the slides in link in the chat, as well as now it is here on the screen, and the QR code is here. And we called out a couple. Erin and I have been working on this topic together for quite a long time at this point. So we realized we no longer had like a one slide collaborator slide. So we chose to call out some of the folks that we have worked with on specific aspects of this project. And we thank them as well as our research groups overall.
Great. Thank you so much, Jackie and Erin, for this. And while people hopefully have some questions for the Q&A, I wanted to make sort of like a comment and a question, so to get that started. I think one of the things I noticed with I'm not sure what we're calling it, the rubric to look at the different types of accessibility challenges and things like that, is it seems like it'd be really applicable to all sorts of things within the physics and astronomy learning space environment. Like I was thinking about, because this was something that actually was brought up to me recently, was faculty meetings. Are you aware of this being used in all sorts of other environments with different things? Because faculty are people too, and some of them have, accessibility needs that aren't being met.
Yeah, so I think, go ahead, Erin.
So I think the short answer is we haven't currently used it that way, but I feel like that's a really great example. And I feel like one of the values of this tool is that it can be flexible to whatever kind of programming you're developing, right? So it's useful in the instructional environment, in the research environment, in the event planning spaces. Jackie and I have a book chapter coming out where we're considering what that can look like in a couple other spaces as well. So yeah, I think that this is useful in a lot of different contexts.
And we've done, so I've done with Geraldine Cochran back in 2019, we were asked to present to the PhysCon SPS, so students. And so we thought with them about some of the meetings that they were creating. And we did what we were just talking about thinking about multiple aspects of people's identity, but they really got into like the time of day when a meeting happened, the modalities. This was pre-COVID, so they weren't maybe thinking of Zoom as much as a modality. But I think that's been one of the really big design choices that has been very clearly a choice, is the pivot back to requiring in-person participation in things, and not attending to the different ways that that is then creating barriers for people. Yes, so I think faculty meetings are a great example, because faculty are people and they're older people, so they have likely acquired more disabilities over time. So I know our faculty meetings are impacted by people with autoimmune disorders, by people with hearing disorders. And yeah, this would be a great tool to think about that ahead of time instead of as an emergency each time it comes up for a person.
Right, and there is a question. So how much of this, I think the entire body of work, can be applied to graduate programs? Because some people, unfortunately, face issues within their regarding ableism in the graduate programs, that means they unfortunately don't complete?
So I think that one of my research interests is shifting to looking at graduate education. Um, I think that is one of the places where our community identity about what it means to be a physicist and do physics um, can have a big impact on then who makes it to the next stage of physics. So I know one of the things folks have been considering looking at are like qualifying exam practices and candidacy exam practices. I've actually seen a student be able to do their dissertation defense by pre-recording, and then we asked questions via chat so that they had more time to process the question and respond to the question. And that was just a random committee I happened to be on. So I think that, you know, there are some aspects of flexibility out there, but then we also have programs that are like, you must take these 4 exams and you must get a 60% on them. And if you don't, um, then you're out of this program. So that's program level flexibility. And then we could also have individual research PI flexibility, where you're setting the standards for what it means to be actively engaged in your lab. And that can be very ableist. PIs are known to take advantage of grad students and expect them to work without breaks, and those sorts of things.
And you have a
Go ahead.
two-parter, or does Erin want to go and answer this as well? Okay, cool. You
that's
have a
totally fine.
two-parter question, so I will break it up into 2 different things. The first question is, where do you all think that verbal communication impairment fall on this framework?
Yeah, great question. I think in my view, that's one of the limitations of this tool. I think that the tool, when we were designing it, was intended to consider a wide variety of identities. And speech, I feel like, kind of hits a couple of the different dimensions. And I think that's true about many different diagnoses, that they might primarily fall in one dimension, but could spread across multiple different dimensions. I think, especially things like chronic health conditions, I think commonly fall across different ones. So yeah, so I don't really have a very good answer for you. I'm sorry. I think that's one of the limitations.
And then the follow-up question, the second question is, how do you deal with thinking about how activities load on categories that encompass many different types of experiences? Specifically thinking about the physical mobility category, which encompasses both fine motor and gross motor abilities, for example.
You want to take that, or you want me to?
I can take a quick stab. So I would say because our goal with that tool is not to problem solve for an individual person. I think what we try to think about in the physical mobility category is both of those things. So both, what are the fine motor needs that are required to engage in a setting, and what are the gross motor skills that are required to engage in a setting. So I think you saw that when we considered both like responding to a clicker question and getting to a space within that same category. This would shift, and we've seen this shift in our interviews when we talk to instructors about teaching and then mentors about research, that often when they shift to talking about research, they're really thinking about an individual person and creating access for that person. And so I think that's when you know, you saw us go off that template to think about an REU inclusive practice. So I think there are times when that template is all that we have because we don't know who's going to be in a space, or we're designing for a space. And then we want to think as broadly within those categories as possible. And then there's times when we are creating access for an individual person, and then we want to normalize that, acknowledge the things that are providing access for us in the space, and create the best solution for the individual.
And I think one thing as well, again, with that refrain from disability justice space about nothing about us without us, I think this is another place where you can bring in students with disabilities into the environment, is like have students be involved in the conversation about exactly where the different instructional strategies load on the different dimensions, so that we can consider a wide variety of things. Personally, right, like I identify with an emotional mental health impairment, right? So I might have some ideas of what that looks like, but it's not going to be the same as somebody else's experience, right? So considering the wide variety of experiences and trying to be broad in our consideration is a good step.
And I think that's a great comment to end on, because we are at top of the hour wherever you are. And
Okay.
I stopped the recording. Thank you everybody for attending, and thank you especially Jackie and Erin for giving this talk.